Police officer Derek Kanan sat in his patrol car, the rumble of the old engine droning on like a persistent reminder of the familiar monotony of late nights. The leather seat beneath him vibrated slightly, creaking softly with each shift of his weight. Derek sighed, his eyes gazing through the windshield at the dimly lit streets. The faint glow of streetlights reflected on the shadowed roads, where rows of dilapidated houses and shuttered storefronts silently told a story of decay. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, not to any cheerful rhythm, but out of impatience. Each tap carried the weariness of a man trapped in a cycle of meaningless repetition. Just 3 more hours. Derek thought to himself, glancing at the clock on the dashboard. 3 hours stretched before him like an eternity, an unbroken torture of monotony. As he rolled past a corner, something made him pause. In the muted light, a figure came into view, a black woman standing by the door of a closed shop. Her posture was slightly hunched, one hand gripping a plastic grocery bag, the other clutching a worn wooden cane. An oversized coat all but swallowed her petite frame, while a wide-brimmed hat cast her face in shadow. "What's she doing out here at this hour?" Derek wondered, narrowing his eyes. There was something about her that set him on edge. Not her appearance, but her presence at this time and place. Too late for an elderly woman to be wandering the streets, too suspicious to be standing so still. Disjointed thoughts raced through his mind. Was she homeless? Or worse, was she involved in something illegal? Derek had spent years honing what he called his trouble radar, and to him, this woman fit the profile of someone hiding something, a person who might be a victim but could just as easily be a threat. He pulled his car to a stop across the street, his eyes never leaving her. She didn't move, save for an occasional shift of her weight from one foot to the other. That seemingly insignificant gesture only deepened Derek's suspicion. Just standing there is enough, he thought. In this neighborhood, at this hour, one didn't need to do much to become a target of Derek's scrutiny. Taking a deep breath, he tightened his grip on the steering wheel, the familiar rush of vigilance surging through him. Yet, somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered, "Am I judging too quickly?" But that thought was swiftly drowned out by the instincts forged from years on the job, the instincts he trusted implicitly. Sharp! The wheels rolled slowly, but Derek's pulse quickened, not from fear, but from a strange sense of anticipation. He liked this feeling, power, the authority to command, to make others comply, or at the very least, show respect. But this woman, she wasn't like the people he usually dealt with. Derek shifted the car into park. The door closed with a sharp click, and the echo of his boots hitting the pavement broke the stillness of the night. As he crossed the street, his eyes stayed locked on her. She barely reacted to his approach. No nervousness, no restlessness. It didn't just unsettle him, it piqued his curiosity. "What are you doing here?" Derek called out, his voice cutting through the silence with a sharp edge. The woman slowly turned her head. Her eyes, hidden beneath the brim of her wide hat, glimmered faintly in the weak light. She didn't speak, didn't flinch. That only made Derek more tense. He took a few steps closer, and narrowing the distance between them. Up close, she looked even older than he had first thought. Her wrinkled skin, bony hands clutching the plastic bag, and the oversized coat engulfing her slight frame painted a picture of frailty and isolation. "What are you doing here?" Derek repeated, his tone firm, words chosen to demand compliance. He expected an immediate answer, but instead the woman merely blinked. Her calm, cold gaze seemed to scrutinize him, as if weighing something about him. "I asked you a question." Derek stepped closer, his posture rigid, projecting dominance. "Do you have an ID?" The woman remained silent for a moment, her eyes searching his as though probing for something beneath his uniform. Her stillness made Derek uneasy. Finally, her voice broke the silence, soft yet resolute. "I've done nothing wrong, officer. I'm just on my way home." Derek smirked, a sharp, mocking laugh escaping his lips. "Home? It's past midnight. You shouldn't be wandering around like this. What's in the bag?" The woman glanced down at the plastic bag in her hand. "Just some groceries," she replied calmly, lifting it slightly as if to show there was nothing suspicious inside. Derek wasn't swayed by her composure. All he could see was the contradiction between her words and her detached demeanor. It grated on him, igniting a sense of frustration as the questions in his mind began to pile up. Derek had encountered all kinds of people in his career. Most understood it was unwise to argue with the police, especially in a sensitive area like this. But this woman, she wasn't like anyone else. There was no fear, no nervousness. That not only surprised him, but also ignited a fierce urge, a need to assert his authority. "Let me see what's in the bag," Derek said, his voice now lower, tinged with menace. The woman sighed, wariness etched on her face. She lifted the bag and slowly opened it, revealing its simple contents: a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and a few canned goods. Nothing unusual, yet the emptiness of the bag only irritated Derek further. He had expected something: contraband, stolen goods, or at least something to validate his suspicion. Instead, he was left with a growing sense of frustration. "That's it?" he asked through gritted teeth, his voice faltering into doubt. He glanced back at the street, ensuring no one was watching. But Derek knew the furtive gazes from the shadowed corners of the neighborhood were still there. "Is that all?" The woman nodded, her tone calm. "There's nothing else." Derek felt the anger rising within him, a simmering need to reassert his dominance, to remind her and himself who was in control. "Your ID?" he demanded, feeling the tension in his own voice. She waited, silent for a moment, her thin hands moving deliberately into the folds of her coat. Derek's fingers hovered instinctively near his hip. Finally, she pulled out a worn wallet and handed it to him without a word. He snatched it, glancing quickly at the name and address. Margaret Hill, a local address. Nothing suspicious. But that wasn't the point anymore. The situation was slipping from his grasp, and it gnawed at his ego. "What are you really doing here?" he pressed, leaning in closer, his tone sharper, almost a hiss. "I don't believe your story." Margaret met his gaze directly, her face unwavering. "I've told you the truth, officer. I'm just trying to get home. There's no need to treat me like a criminal." The street around them remained eerily quiet. Occasionally, the distant hum of a car engine or the faint murmur of a passing conversation drifted through the air. A few pedestrians hurried by, keeping their distance as they noticed the confrontation, unwilling to get caught up in whatever might unfold. The amber glow of the streetlights cast long, warped shadows across the cracked pavement, creating an unsettling tableau, as though everything was happening in a distorted dream. Derek stood there, simmering with each passing second. Across from him, Margaret remained calm and steadfast. Her composure felt like a blow to his ego. Derek's patience was wearing thin, the feeling of control slipping through his fingers like water he couldn't grasp. His hands twitched at his sides, his fingers itching to do something, anything, to provoke the reaction he wanted: fear, obedience, submission. But Margaret simply stood her ground. The cane hung loosely in her hand, her steady gaze fixed on him with an unreadable expression. It wasn't defiance, but it was far from fear. It was confidence, and that made everything worse. Her confidence, even in the face of his authority, was a problem. "You don't belong in this neighborhood, do you?" Derek spat, stepping closer, so near now that his breath, hot and laced with the stale bitterness of the coffee he'd been drinking all night, brushed against her. Margaret didn't flinch. "I've lived in this neighborhood longer than you have, Sergeant," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "I know these streets better than most." Derek clenched his jaw. It wasn't the answer he was expecting. He wanted her to back down, to show some sign that she feared him, that she recognized the power he held over her. But she didn't. Margaret spoke as though she had nothing to fear, as though she was the one in control of the situation. "Then you should know better than to stand out here in the middle of the night," Derek growled, his voice rough and cutting. "You know what's been happening in this neighborhood, don't you? It's not safe, especially for someone like you." Margaret's gaze didn't waver. "I've seen worse things than you could imagine, officer. Standing outside a closed shop isn't one of them." Her words hit Derek like a sharp sting. He couldn't quite put his finger on why. Maybe it was the way she said it, calm, composed, as though she had nothing to prove. That only made his blood boil more. He took another step closer, so near now that their shoes almost touched. He could see the wrinkles etched into her face, the strands of silver hair escaping from under her wide-brimmed hat. She looked tired but not fragile, and that infuriated him even more. "Let me tell you something, lady," he said, his voice low and heavy with barely restrained anger. "You don't get to talk to me like that. You don't get to stand here acting like you're above the rules. You don't get to disrespect me." Margaret tilted her head slightly, her lips pressed into a thoughtful line. She looked at him, really looked at him, as if she were trying to unravel him, peeling back the layers of his anger to find something deeper. Her silence unsettled Derek, as though she could see right through the uniform, past the badge, and into something he didn't want to admit about himself. "I don't mean any disrespect, officer," she said softly after a long pause. "I'm just not afraid of you." That was it. Derek's vision blurred with rage, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. How dare she? How dare this old woman stand there and say that to him, a police officer? It wasn't just an insult to him, it was an insult to everything he stood for. He drew in a sharp breath, struggling to rein in his emotions. But just then, a faint sound broke through the tension, the light, unmistakable shuffle of footsteps on the pavement. Derek spun around, his eyes scanning the dim street. From a shadowy corner, a figure emerged, walking at a steady, deliberate pace. The glow of the streetlights caught the face of a middle-aged man dressed in a thick jacket and a worn baseball cap. He stopped, his curious gaze shifting between Derek and Margaret. "Is everything all right here?" the man asked, his voice gravelly but kind. Margaret turned her head and gave him a small nod. "I'm fine, thank you." The man lingered, his eyes on Derek now. They weren't hostile, but neither were they trusting. "Just wanted to make sure she's okay," he added before turning slowly and walking away, his steps echoing faintly in the tense silence he left behind. Derek exhaled sharply, frustration tightening in his chest. He didn't know what to do next. The control he had prided himself on seemed to have slipped away, not just because of Margaret, but now because of the unexpected witness. Yet one thing was certain. Margaret's steady, unshaken presence remained untouched, and it made him feel like the loser in a confrontation he had created. She was supposed to be afraid. Derek was used to that, used to the wary glances, used to the authority his uniform commanded. "You should be," he hissed, his voice barely louder than a whisper. His hand twitched near his belt where his flashlight hung like a silent threat. "You don't know who you're messing with." Margaret's eyes flicked down briefly, catching the movement of his hand, but she didn't step back. She didn't even blink. "And you don't know who you're speaking to, Sergeant Derek," she replied, her voice unnervingly calm. Derek's stomach twisted. The way she said his name, his full name, sent a jolt through him. How did she know? He hadn't introduced himself. The realization struck him like a slap, but he quickly brushed it aside. She must have seen his name badge. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Derek spat, his words laced with venom. "You think you can stand here and talk to me like that, like you're better than me?" "I never said that," Margaret responded, her voice still steady, maddeningly composed. "I'm just trying to get home." Derek abruptly stepped closer, eliminating what little space remained between them. "You're lying. I know you're lying. I can see it in your eyes." Margaret's gaze didn't waver. "And what do you see in my eyes, officer?" Derek opened his mouth to answer, but no words came out. For the first time in their standoff, he felt at a loss. What did he see in her eyes? He didn't know. All he knew was that she wasn't reacting the way he expected. She wasn't afraid, and that fact alone made him lose his grip on his own composure. More than he cared to admit, Derek was feeling a terrifying sense of losing control. "You won't get away with this," he said again, his voice trembling. "I'll make sure of it." But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were hollow. For the first time in his career, he wasn't certain what would happen next. Margaret, with her calm and resolute silence, had completely unbalanced him. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, his body poised as if bracing for something. But nothing happened. Margaret remained still, her eyes locked on his, filled with an unreadable expression. In that moment, Derek felt a chilling sliver of doubt creep in. For the first time, he questioned his own motives, his role in this standoff. That doubt, small as it was, planted a seed of fear in his heart. Margaret's gaze stayed steady. "What do you think you're going to do?" she asked softly, her question cutting deep into his mind. Suddenly, Derek lunged forward, grabbing Margaret's thin arm with a grip far stronger than he'd intended. Her body jerked toward him. In that brief moment, he saw a flicker of pain flash across her face, but she didn't make a sound. "You think you can talk to me like that?" Derek hissed through clenched teeth, his face inches from hers. "You think I'm just going to let you walk away?" Margaret said nothing, her eyes dropping to his hand, gripping her arm before rising again to meet his gaze. "Let me go," she said softly, her tone calm but firm. Derek tightened his grip, his fingers pressing into her fragile skin. A part of him screamed to pull back, to stop, but the roar of frustration inside him drowned out that instinct. Margaret held his gaze. "Is this really about me, Officer Derek?" she asked, her voice steady, unwavering. "Or is it about you?" More than he was willing to admit, Derek was feeling a terrifying sense of losing control. "You're not getting away with this," he said again, his voice trembling. "I'll make sure of it." But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were hollow. For the first time in his career, he had no idea what would happen next. Margaret, with her calm, unwavering silence, had completely thrown him off balance. "Cooperate, or this will get much worse." Derek hissed through clenched teeth, his voice tight with restraint. Margaret didn't move, didn't plead, didn't resist. She simply looked at him with those unnervingly calm eyes, as though she could see every bitter struggle playing out inside him. "You lost control the moment you laid a hand on me, Derek," she said softly, her words slamming shut every escape route in his mind. Before Derek could fully process her words, his fist flew. The punch came in an instant, quick and fueled by raw anger. Margaret staggered back, clutching her cane before it slipped from her grasp. Her groceries scattered across the ground, cans clinking coldly under the harsh glow of the streetlights. Derek stood frozen, his fist still clenched, his breathing ragged and uneven. Margaret pushed herself up slowly from the pavement, her movements deliberate, like a character in a slow-motion film. She wiped the blood from her lip with the back of her hand, but when she looked up, her expression had changed. Not to one of pain or fear, but disappointment. "You'll regret this," she said, her voice calm, a stark contrast to the tremor building in Derek's chest. For a brief moment, her words hung in the air, like a sentence passed down by an unseen judge. Derek raised his hand again, as though to defend himself or say something, but the distant wail of a police siren sliced through the silence. The sound froze him in place. He knew then with dreadful certainty that there was no going back. When Margaret turned back to face him, her gaze remained calm and steady, but now there was something different in her eyes, something that made Derek's stomach knot with a cold sense of dread. It wasn't fear nor pain, but disappointment. "You'll regret this," she said softly, her voice light yet carrying an undeniable weight. A chill ran down Derek's spine. The way she spoke, with an uncanny certainty, unsettled him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He opened his mouth, trying to regain control with some sort of response, but nothing came out of his parched throat. A tightening sensation rose within him, and his tongue suddenly felt leaden. Margaret reached into the pocket of her coat. Her movements were slow and deliberate, as if time itself had paused. Derek's instincts flared. His hand moved toward his gun, fingers gripping the handle tightly. Unease crept into his mind as he tracked her every move. For a brief and terrifying moment, he thought she might be drawing a weapon, something she had hidden all along, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But it wasn't a weapon. What she pulled from her pocket was a small black leather wallet. Margaret opened it slowly, with a practiced motion. Inside was a gleaming gold and silver FBI badge, catching the dim glow of the streetlight above. Derek's eyes widened, his breath hitching in his throat as he stared at the badge in disbelief. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing. His heart pounded violently in his chest, each beat louder than the last. Margaret spoke, her voice calm yet carrying an authority more terrifying than any shout or threat. "I'm Special Agent Margaret Hill." She paused, her unwavering gaze locked on Derek's face. "And you, Officer Derek, have just made a very, very big mistake." The world around Derek tilted. A wave of panic and nausea washed over him. His hand fell away from the gun, hanging limply by his side as he stared at the badge of the woman he had just attacked. The story began to crystallize in his mind. Margaret wasn't just a passerby. She was an undercover FBI agent. The reality of what he had just done crashed over him like a tidal wave, crushing every coherent thought and shred of reason. Derek tried to speak, to find some excuse or justification that might undo the damage. But there was nothing. There was no way to take back the punch, no way to erase the fact that he had just assaulted a federal agent in broad daylight on a public street. Margaret stood tall, her gaze unyielding. Calmly, she picked up the items that had spilled from her bag, a can of food, a loaf of bread now dusted with dirt, and adjusted her hat. In the eerie silence, Derek realized that everything had changed forever. The distant sound of police sirens pierced the quiet, cutting through the air like a blade. Margaret said nothing more, but her eyes conveyed what her words didn't, that this story was far from over. His entire career, everything he had ever done, disintegrated before his eyes. Margaret took a step toward him, her gaze never leaving him. "Backup is on the way," she said calmly, her voice almost sympathetic but as sharp as a blade. "You'll pay for what you've done, Officer Derek." Derek's stomach churned, his knees felt like they might buckle, his mind screaming at him to run. Run before it's too late. But his body was frozen in place, paralyzed by the weight of his own actions. He had crossed a line, one he could never step back over. Margaret's steady voice cut through the fog in his thoughts. She didn't shout, but every word she spoke felt like a final judgment being sealed. "It's over for you." In the distance, Derek could hear faint sirens approaching, growing louder with each passing second. His heart pounded in his chest, his hands trembling as he stared at the woman in front of him. She was no longer just an elderly stranger. She was an FBI agent who now held his fate in her hands, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Derek Kanan stood there, his eyes fixed on the FBI badge in Margaret Hill's hand, as though it were a coiled snake ready to strike. His mind raced, struggling to comprehend what had just happened, to reconcile the image of the frail old woman he had struck with the seasoned federal agent now standing before him. A strange buzzing filled his ears, and a sinking sensation pooled in his stomach as the reality of his actions bore down on him like an oppressive weight. He had punched an undercover FBI agent. Yes, he had done that. The truth was undeniable, a massive boulder crushing his chest. The wail of the sirens grew louder now, but Derek barely registered them. His heartbeat thundered in his chest, drowning out all the noise of the city around him. His hand hovered near his belt, unsure of what to do. Should he grab the radio and call for help? No, it was useless. Help was already coming, but it wasn't for him. He wouldn't be the one rescued tonight. Margaret stood silently. Her posture was relaxed but exuded authority. Her face still bore a faint bruise from his punch, but her expression was unreadable. She had moved past the physical pain, and now she stood as the embodiment of the law, the judge and the one who would bring this night to its conclusion. Derek could see that what remained was something far more unsettling. She wasn't angry, she didn't yell or threaten, but simply stood there, waiting, as if she already knew what would come next. Like a spectator to the script of fate, Margaret stayed silent, her gaze sharp as a dagger slicing through his mind. With every passing second, the stillness seemed to suffocate the air around him. "I don't understand," Derek muttered, his voice shaky and weak, like a child caught red-handed. "This isn't supposed to happen." Margaret didn't respond immediately. She remained motionless, yet her eyes bore an invisible weight that pressed down on him, making him feel like he was sinking into a bottomless void. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm and composed as ever. "You made it happen, Derek. You made your choice." Derek's jaw clenched, his hands balling into fists. The street fell eerily silent, save for the distant wail of approaching sirens. The familiar sounds that once reassured him now only fueled his anxiety. Police lights flickered in the distance, red and blue flashing across the worn walls. But instead of offering him safety, the sight made his knees threaten to give out. "I didn't," Derek started, his voice catching in his throat. "I didn't know who you were. I didn't know you were FBI. I was just doing my job." Margaret cut through his defense with a cold, unwavering tone. "Don't make excuses, Derek. Accuracy is all that matters now." Derek stared at her, his face contorted in a mix of confusion and anger. He felt like he was trapped in a nightmare with no way out. This was supposed to be his world, where he set the rules. But now, everything had turned upside down. Margaret took a step closer, standing only inches away. "You think you're above the law, don't you?" she said softly, her voice almost a whisper, but razor sharp. You've been doing this for a long time, picking on those you thought couldn't fight back. But tonight, Derek, you picked the wrong person. Derek's throat tightened. He wanted to shout back, to defend himself against her accusations, but the crushing weight of the truth held him down. Margaret knew. She didn't just know, she saw right through him. She knew exactly who he was and what he'd done. I was just... Derek tried, but his weak protest was drowned out by Margaret's piercing gaze. Just enforcing the law? Margaret tilted her head, her eyes cutting into him. Don't delude yourself, Derek. I've been watching your department for a while. The corruption, the abuse of power, it runs deep, and you're part of it. Derek's eyes widened. His heart seemed to stop for a moment. Rumors of a federal investigation had echoed through the precinct halls, but no one thought it would reach him. He wasn't a criminal, at least not in his own mind. He was just a cop, doing his job. I didn't mean to. Derek started, but Margaret didn't let him finish. You didn't think anyone would hold you accountable, but you were wrong. Dead wrong. Margaret stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. The bruise on her cheek was now fully visible under the streetlight, a stark reminder of what had transpired. But now you'll face the consequences, she said, her voice devoid of any sympathy. The sirens grew louder, their wailing a harbinger of inevitable judgment. Derek stood there, trembling, not the confident police officer he once was, but a man stripped of all power, all excuses. He knew his time was up. Derek turned his head slightly, his eyes catching the flashing lights of the patrol cars speeding toward him. Each passing second felt like a blade cutting deeper into his mind. A black SUV and 2 patrol cars screeched to a halt, the sound of tires tearing through the stillness of the night. Car doors swung open and a group of men in suits stepped out, their faces grim and their demeanor uncompromising. Behind them came uniformed police officers, their purposeful steps echoing like a collective judgment. Derek's breath caught as he recognized a tall FBI agent with a stern expression and piercing eyes approaching Margaret. The agent gave her a slight nod, his gaze showing undisguised respect. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice calm but urgent. Margaret nodded, a brief but firm gesture. "I'm fine," she said softly but confidently. "I have everything I need." A chill ran down Derek's spine. Everything I need. Those words echoed in his head like the tolling of a death knell. His eyes locked on Margaret, drawn to a small, chilling detail, a tiny, almost imperceptible camera discreetly embedded in the collar of her coat. It had silently captured everything, every moment, every word, every action. It was irrefutable evidence. His breath hitched again. Everything he had just done, the punch, the threats, the abuse of power, had been recorded. Derek felt the ground slipping away beneath him, the world collapsing piece by piece. "You set me up," he whispered, his voice filled with confusion and despair. His words hung in the air, a belated confession. Margaret stood motionless, her gaze unwavering. At first, she simply stared at him, her eyes calm yet razor-sharp, cutting through the confidence he had spent years building. Finally, she spoke, her tone steady and cold, each word like a dagger piercing his soul. "I didn't need to set you up, Officer Derek. You set yourself up the moment you chose to abuse your authority. All I did was give you the chance to reveal your true nature." Her words hit him like a hammer, leaving Derek stunned. Cold sweat beaded on his forehead, and the pounding in his temples grew so intense he could almost hear it. His hands trembled uncontrollably. His heart raced as chaotic thoughts overwhelmed him. He had always believed his badge was an impenetrable shield, granting him the freedom to act without consequences. But now, that illusion had shattered. In just a few short moments, his life, his career, his honor, had disintegrated. The other agents moved closer, their steps deliberate and commanding. Margaret stepped back, her gaze still fixed on Derek, not with triumph or anger, but with a chilling calmness. "You'll pay for this, Derek," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. And with those words, Derek knew his story had come to an end. Here's the English translation, crafted with precision to retain the original tone and meaning. Around Derek, the voices of the agents echoed, but they seemed to come from a distant world. The sounds were vague, distorted, as if filtering through a dense layer of water. One of the agents grabbed his hand, pulled it behind his back, and locked the cold metal cuffs tightly around his wrists. Derek didn't resist. He couldn't. His mind was paralyzed, overwhelmed by the weight of the mistakes he had just made. For the first time in his life, Derek Kane understood what it felt like to be on the other side of the law. The irony wasn't lost on him. A police officer who had once taken pride in cuffing hundreds of people now stood helpless as he was handcuffed himself. Cold, sharp, and merciless. They led Derek to the waiting patrol car. The flashing lights from the police vehicles blurred everything, turning it into a hazy, endless nightmare. As they pushed him into the back seat, Derek glanced over his shoulder. Margaret was still standing there, exactly where she had been all this time. Her expression hadn't changed. No anger, no satisfaction, just a calm, cold gaze, as if this were just another day at work. And maybe for her, it was. Before the car door closed, Margaret spoke. Her voice wasn't loud, but each word rang out clear and sharp, like a blade. "This isn't just about you, Officer Derek," she said, her eyes never leaving him. "This is about your entire precinct, the entire system you've been protecting. We're going to bring it all down." Those words struck Derek like a spear. His heart sank, and his spirit plunged into a chasm of despair. He had thought the worst was over. But as the car door slammed shut behind him, Derek realized his nightmare was only beginning. The patrol car jolted slightly as it hit a pothole, snapping Derek out of his thoughts. He sat there, his hands bound tightly, his eyes staring blankly into space. The air inside the car was suffocating, heavy with the scent of old leather and sweat, but nothing felt more stifling than his own mind, a chaotic storm of confusion, fear, and disbelief. The events of the past hour replayed in his head like a broken reel of film. The confrontation, the punch, Margaret's glinting badge, the revelation that she wasn't just some ordinary old woman but an undercover FBI agent, the crushing reality that he had done the unthinkable, assaulted a federal agent, pressed down on him relentlessly. Derek glanced out the window, watching the city blur past in streaks of light and shadow. These streets had once been his domain, a place where he felt a sense of absolute control. But now they seemed alien, cold, as if he were seeing them from the wrong side of the law. And that's exactly where he was. His stomach churned as he thought about what awaited him. He had seen what happened to officers who crossed the line. Some were lucky to get away with a slap on the wrist, but others lost everything. This wasn't just some minor scandal. He hadn't just bent the rules or abused his authority. He had struck an FBI agent and done it in front of a camera. Fear engulfed him as he asked himself, why did it come to this? But deep down, Derek knew there were no answers that could save him now. The patrol car came to a slow stop outside the police station. The red and blue lights flickered against the building's walls, casting an eerie glow across the parking lot. Derek's heart pounded, his pulse racing wildly. This was not how he had ever imagined returning to the station, a place he had entered hundreds, perhaps thousands of times before as an officer, as an enforcer of the law. But now he was stepping inside in a different role, a criminal. The back door of the patrol car swung open, and a young officer, not someone Derek recognized, gestured for him to step out. Derek hesitated, if only for a split second, but the gravity of the moment pressed down on him, freezing his body in place. The young officer didn't wait. He grabbed Derek's arm firmly, pulling him out of the car with a care that was measured but far from lenient. As Derek stood upright, the reality of the situation hit him like a freight train. The clinking of handcuffs echoed in the air, the cold metallic sound emphasizing his despair and helplessness. The chill of the cuffs bit into his wrists, and each step toward the station's entrance grew heavier than the last. He saw faces turn from within, officers, staff, colleagues who had once worked alongside him. Now they watched his every step with confusion and disbelief. "What the hell is going on?" someone muttered, their voice tinged with bewilderment. "Is that Derek in cuffs?" another voice whispered, barely audible amidst the growing murmur. Derek could feel the stares, sharp and piercing. The eyes of those who had once admired him, who had shared drinks with him, who had endured grueling shifts by his side. But now they looked at him as if he were a stranger, a traitor. He lowered his head, refusing to meet any gaze. He didn't need to look to know what they were thinking. They all had the same question. How could this happen? They led him past the front area, where officers and staff stood frozen, their stunned eyes following him. Whispers spread like wildfire, engulfing Derek in waves of shame and despair with every passing second. His legs no longer felt like his own. Each step was a painful reminder of what had happened and of what was yet to come. When they reached the processing desk, Derek was shoved into a chair in front of a thick glass partition. The young officer stepped back, making way for another, a middle-aged man with a hard expression, clearly accustomed to dealing with hardened criminals rather than former colleagues. He sat across from Derek, clipboard in hand, his cold gaze fixed on him for a few moments as if trying to process what he was seeing. "Name?" the man asked, his tone flat and professional, as though this were just another routine intake. Derek swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing, but every word seemed stuck in his throat. He struggled to respond but couldn't. Shame and despair had choked the voice out of him. In the heavy, suffocating silence, Derek felt more acutely than ever that he was no longer himself. He was no longer Officer Derek Kane. He was just a man who had failed, a man crushed by the very system he had once served so faithfully. Derek stood still in the narrow, confined cell, the cold, fluorescent light above his head intensifying the oppressive atmosphere. The metallic clatter of the lock echoed in the still air, underscoring an unchangeable truth. He was now a prisoner. His hands remained cuffed, the icy metal biting lightly into his wrists with every movement. He slumped down onto the cold metal bed bolted to the wall. The bed was bare, save for a thin, worn-out mattress. The wall opposite was covered in crude scrawls and scratch marks, symbols of anger, despair, and the endless passage of time. Everything around him screamed a harsh reality. This was his new existence. Derek's mind churned in chaos. Regret and anger tangled together in his thoughts, pulling him deeper into the void. He wanted to blame someone. Margaret, the FBI agents, the system. But deep down he knew the truth. It was his fault. He had let his rage override his reason. He had made the wrong choices. Hours crawled by in a suffocating silence. Occasionally the sound of footsteps echoing down the corridor or distant murmurs broke the stillness. Derek closed his eyes, resting his head in his hands, trying to devise a plan, an excuse, anything to pull himself out of this situation. But every thought led to a dead end. He had gone too far, and there was no way back. The sound of approaching footsteps broke through his reverie, slow but deliberate. Derek raised his head, his eyes meeting the familiar face of Lieutenant Greg Hannon, his direct superior. Greg stood outside the bars, arms crossed, his expression a mix of disappointment and restrained anger. "What the hell happened, Derek?" Greg asked, his voice low but heavy with weight. "What did you do?" Derek wanted to say something, anything to justify himself. But his mouth was dry, and every word felt lodged in his throat. He didn't know where to begin. How could he explain how quickly everything had spiraled out of control? How could he justify what he'd done? He started, but the words that came out felt empty and meaningless. Greg shook his head, his gaze sharp yet not entirely devoid of compassion. "It just happened?" Greg repeated, his eyebrows knitting together. "You think that's enough? Derek, you didn't just ruin your own life. You dragged the whole team, the entire department, into this mess. What do you think happens next?" Derek lowered his head, unable to meet his superior's piercing gaze. He had no answers, no excuses, only one painful, undeniable truth. He had destroyed everything. Greg sighed, the sound heavy with fatigue. "You put yourself here, Derek, and now no one can save you." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Derek alone with his thoughts. The slam of the corridor door echoed like a grim punctuation to Derek's fate. Derek sat motionless in the cell, the cold glare of the neon light casting sharp shadows across his tense face. Lieutenant Hanin's final words still echoed in his mind, like an unrelenting verdict. "What you've done, Derek, cannot be undone. Now, all you can do is face the consequences." He lowered his head, his hands covering his face. His apologies felt meaningless, even to himself. The cell door had slammed shut behind Hanin, the metallic clang reverberating through the corridor like the toll of a bell marking an end. Derek leaned back onto the bed, his hollow gaze fixed on the ceiling. The oppressive silence engulfed him, leaving nothing but guilt and regret to consume him. Elsewhere in the city, Margaret Hill sat in a makeshift briefing room. The fluorescent lights illuminated the cramped windowless space. The walls, lined with corkboards, were covered in photos, documents, and maps that meticulously chronicled months of investigation. The long table in the center of the room was cluttered with stacks of files and papers, scattered haphazardly as agents worked through them. Margaret leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of the evening pressing down on her. It wasn't just the dull ache from Derek's punch, though her bruised cheek still throbbed. It was the emptiness and exhaustion that came with the conclusion of an undercover mission. Confronting Derek had been a victory, but it was also an experience that left her introspective. Across the table, agent in charge Daniel Harris, her supervisor, was poring over the latest reports. A tall man with a stern face and piercing eyes, Harris exuded calm authority. Decades of experience in the Bureau had honed his ability to make swift, precise decisions, even in the most stressful situations. Harris glanced up at Margaret, his gaze unreadable but tinged with concern. "Are you holding up, Hill?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Margaret nodded, though the ache in her cheek reminded her of the night's events. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice steady but weary. "This isn't the first time I've had to deal with something like this." Harris studied her for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. "That was one hell of a punch, but you handled it well." Margaret gave a faint, humorless smile. "If I hadn't, we wouldn't have gotten what we needed." But the room fell into silence, broken only by the rustle of papers being flipped. Harris set down the clipboard he was holding, clasping his hands together. "We've got enough evidence to move forward now," he said, his tone resolute. "But you know this is just the beginning. A lot of people are going to get caught up in this, and the pressure won't let up." Margaret nodded, her eyes reflecting steely determination. "I know, but sometimes, to dismantle a rotten system, sacrifices have to be made." Harris regarded her for a long moment, then gave a faint smile. "Good. Then get ready. The real work is just beginning." The room was steeped in silence, the weight of Margaret's words hanging in the air like a thick, dark cloud. The tension between Margaret and the other agents needed no words to be understood. All eyes were on her. Margaret knew that Derek was not the only issue. He was merely the tip of the iceberg, an iceberg that was slowly eroding the system from within. "You were right about him from the start." Harris finally broke the silence, his voice cutting through the stillness. He tapped his pen lightly against the edge of the table, his sharp gaze fixed on Margaret. "We knew there were problems in that department, but Derek, he's worse than we thought." Margaret sighed, her shoulders heavy under the weight of the entire investigation. "I saw it from the beginning," she said, her tone steady yet tinged with quiet frustration. "Derek isn't just an officer following orders. He actively seeks reasons to use force, to assert his power. And worse, he enjoys it." The other agents nodded in agreement. They had all seen the same pattern throughout the investigation. Margaret, an older retired woman who had embedded herself in the community, had watched and documented every move. She had witnessed how people of color were treated differently compared to white residents, how officers like Derek abused their authority, not just through their actions, but also through their inactions. "This isn't just about one bad cop," Margaret continued, her gaze locking on each person in the room. "This is about a culture that has been allowed to thrive and fester for years without accountability, and now we're seeing the consequences." Harris leaned forward, breaking the silence once more. "We have everything we need," he said. "Body cam footage, audio recordings, testimonies, enough to make a solid case. Derek's actions tonight sealed his fate." Margaret nodded, but her mind was already beyond Derek. He was just one piece of a larger puzzle. His actions, reprehensible as they were merely symptoms of a deeper problem. "It's not just Derek," Margaret said, her voice hardening. "There's more happening in that department that we haven't uncovered. The corruption runs deep, and I'm not sure we've seen the whole picture yet." Harris nodded, his brow furrowed in thought. "We've been keeping an eye on some other officers. Derek might be the most obvious, but he's not acting alone. Lieutenant Hanen has been on our radar for some time now. His fingerprints are all over this." Anger welled up in Margaret at the mention of Hannon's name. She had kept a close watch on him during her undercover work. Hanen wasn't just aware of what was happening in the police department, he was an active participant, driving it forward. Margaret felt the fury rising within her, but she quickly reined it in. Emotions had no place in her work, only facts mattered. We won't stop at Derek, Margaret said, her voice filled with determination. We'll dig deeper. The truth needs to come to light, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. Harris looked at her, his eyes reflecting respect. Exactly, he said. This is only the beginning. The room was stiflingly silent, the weight of Margaret's words hanging in the air like an invisible pressure, bearing down on everyone present. The tension between Margaret and the group of officers was more than just professional. It was a confrontation between truth and what they had long avoided. Margaret knew that Derek wasn't merely a violator, he was a ticking time bomb, and his actions tonight had been the final tick before the explosion. You were right about him from the start, Harris said, his voice low and deliberate, emphasizing each word. The pen in his hand tapped lightly against the edge of the table, the sound like a knock on the conscience of everyone in the room. We knew there were problems in that department, but Derek? He's far worse than we ever imagined. Margaret sighed, her gaze reflecting both weariness and unyielding resolve. The weight of the entire investigation, of everything she had witnessed, bore down on her small but resilient frame. She recalled the days she spent undercover, disguised as an elderly woman new to the neighborhood. Quietly observing, she had meticulously documented every detail, how officers like Derek abused their power, instilling fear in the community, especially among people of color. She had seen how they bent justice to assert dominance, and even took pleasure in doing so. I saw it from the very beginning, Margaret said, her voice steady but heavy with the weight of undeniable truth. Derek doesn't just follow orders. He actively looks for reasons to use force. He enjoys it, and that makes it all the more terrifying. The rest of the group nodded in agreement. Each of them had seen the signs, the vile, fragmented pieces of a system that had long been rotten. Margaret took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the faces of everyone in the room. This isn't just about one bad cop, she continued, her voice firm. This is about a culture that has been allowed to exist and thrive unchecked for years, and now we're seeing the consequences. We have everything we need now, Harris said, cutting through the heavy silence. His voice was resolute, a declaration of fact. Body cam footage, audio recordings, testimonies, everything we need to convict. Derek's actions tonight sealed his fate. Margaret nodded, but her thoughts had already moved beyond Derek. He wasn't the only problem. He was just one piece of a much larger, darker picture. It's not just Derek, she said, her voice growing stronger. There are other things happening in that department. The corruption runs deep, and I'm not sure we've uncovered everything yet. Harris furrowed his brow, reflecting for a moment. We've been keeping an eye on a few other officers, he said. Derek might be the most obvious, but he's not acting alone. Lieutenant Hanin has been on our radar for a while. His fingerprints are all over this. At the mention of Hanin, a simmering anger rose within Margaret. During her undercover assignment, she had seen firsthand that Hanin wasn't just aware of what was happening, he was actively enabling it, either by encouraging or covering up the wrongdoing. She had scrutinized him closely, every action, every word, and now all roads pointed to the same conclusion. Hanin was far from innocent. We won't stop, Margaret said firmly, her eyes shining with determination. We'll see this through, no matter what we have to face. Harris looked at her, his expression filled with respect. That's exactly what we need, Hill. From now on, we're not just fighting for justice. We're fighting to restore the trust of the people. Margaret stared intently at the files spread across the table, each one representing a heartbreaking story of abuse of power. Names, faces, and injustices stood out vividly in her mind. These weren't just dry documents. They were evidence of a system that had betrayed the very people it was created to protect. She took a deep breath, her eyes drifting to Harris, who was tapping his pen rhythmically on the table, a sound that underscored the urgency of the situation. We have to get this right, Margaret said, her voice low but resolute, her gaze unwavering. When we bring them down, they can't be allowed to come back. No more slaps on the wrist, no more compromises. Harris nodded, his eyes reflecting his agreement. That's the plan, but it'll take time. Right now, we've got Derek, and we're going to flip him. Once he realizes what's at stake, he'll give us everything we need to take down Hanin and the others. Margaret tilted her head, her gaze seeming to pierce through Derek's facade in her memory. Men like Derek always think they're untouchable, she said, her voice tinged with both sharpness and irony. They cling to their power, even when it starts slipping through their fingers. Flipping him won't be easy, and I doubt he'll betray his colleagues without a fight. Harris frowned, clearly having anticipated this. But we've got the upper hand now. Derek's in custody, and with the evidence we've gathered, he can't wriggle out of this. We just need to play our cards right. Margaret instinctively touched her cheek, where a bruise still throbbed faintly. It wasn't just physical pain she felt. The confrontation with Derek wasn't just a skirmish. It was a testament to the deep-seated hatred people like him had for anyone daring to challenge their authority. She recalled his eyes, filled with anger and insecurity, the rage of a man watching his power slip away and willing to do whatever it took to hold on to it. He resorted to violence so easily, Margaret said, her voice laced with profound disappointment. No hesitation, no second thought. Just one moment of being challenged, and he was ready to throw a punch. But that punch didn't bring me down. What haunts me more is realizing just how deep his hatred runs. Harris looked at her, his gaze softening as if to share the burden. People like Derek are the reason we do this work, Margaret. We're here to ensure that behavior like his has no place left to thrive. This isn't just about a few individuals we're investigating. We're trying to dismantle an entire rotten system. Margaret nodded, her hand curling into a fist. Then we can't afford any mistakes. When we bring them down, we have to make sure there's no way for them to return. Harris nodded again, determination flashing in his eyes. We'll do it, Hill. This is just the beginning. Margaret lifted her head from her thoughts as Harris looked at her with concern. Are you okay? He asked, his voice softer this time, as if afraid that a wrong word might wound her. Margaret nodded, though it felt as if the weight of the world was pressing down on her shoulders. Yes, I'm fine, she replied, her tone calm but hollow. The words offered no comfort, not even to herself. She forced a faint smile. It's just thinking about the amount of work we still have ahead of us. Harris nodded, understanding evident in his eyes. We'll get them, he said, his voice resolute. It'll take time, but we'll bring them all down. Margaret wanted to believe him. She had to believe him, for the sake of those who had been hurt. The families torn apart by the abuse of power by men like Derek and the corrupt system that protected them. But deep down, she knew that even if Derek and Hannon were brought down, the fight wouldn't be over. There would always be officers like them, always departments as rotten as this one. The battle for justice had only just begun. As the meeting ended, Margaret packed up her belongings, slipping the files into her bag. While the others dispersed, she lingered for a moment, her gaze resting on the investigation board pinned with faces. Victims, officers, witnesses. Each one represented a piece of a larger story, a story of a system that had rotted from the inside out. She took a deep breath, regaining her focus for the next phase of the mission. Derek was in custody, but the real work was only beginning. Meanwhile, Derek sat alone in his small, empty cell. His back rested against the cold concrete wall, and the dim light from the overhead fluorescent bulb cast a sterile glow over the room. No windows, no clock, no sense of time. Only the endless hum of the light and the echo of his own thoughts, growing louder with each passing second. The air carried the acrid smell of bleach and sweat, clinging to the fibers of his now wrinkled and stained uniform. Though the handcuffs had been removed hours ago, the cold pressure of them still lingered on his wrists. Derek's mind was a chaotic mess of anger, fear, and disbelief. He kept replaying the moment his fist connected with Margaret Hill's face. That brief instant echoed loudly in his mind. The sound of the impact haunted him, each recollection sending a shiver down his spine. He had convinced himself that he was in control, that he had the power. But the reality was that everything had spiraled out of control the moment he laid hands on Margaret. How did I let it go this far? He muttered, his voice dissolving into the air like a confession to no one. He had crossed a line he could never return from, a line that marked the end of his career, his reputation, and the life he once knew. He hadn't just struck a person. He had struck Margaret Hill, an FBI agent, the one who had been watching him, and the one who had set a trap he could no longer deny. Derek buried his head in his hands, the emptiness in his chest spreading. It wasn't just his power he had lost, it was the man he used to be. and now he was left alone, facing the harsh reality of what he had done. That was how Margaret had slowly and deliberately drawn Derek deeper into her trap. Now, he sat in the cold, sterile holding cell, waiting for his fate to be decided by the very people he had called colleagues just hours earlier. The people he thought would stand by him without question were the same ones who had placed him here. The creak of the detention area door echoed its sound stretching down the silent hallway. Derek's head jerked up, his heart pounding in his chest. He expected to see a familiar face, maybe Lieutenant Hanin coming to offer some assurance, or one of the officers from his precinct. But no. When the figure emerged, it wasn't anyone from the local police. Margaret Hill stood at the cell door, flanked by two federal agents in dark suits. A dark bruise spread across her cheek, an angry reminder of the punch Derek had delivered without hesitation. Yet there was no sign of weakness or hurt in her posture, in the way she stood tall, in her cold, sharp gaze. Her eyes betrayed no emotion, no anger, no pity, only the steely resolve of a woman who knew exactly what she needed to do. Derek's mouth went dry. He wanted to say something, anything, to break the suffocating silence, but the words caught in his throat. What could he possibly say? He had struck her. He had attacked her. And now, she stood there, on the other side of the bars, holding his entire future in her hands. One of the agents stepped forward and unlocked the cell door. The metallic clink echoed loudly in the small space, a sound that underscored the inescapable reality. The door swung open, creating a space between Derek and Margaret. The two agents remained by the doorway, their expressions unreadable, like statues waiting silently. Margaret took a step forward. Her gaze stayed fixed on Derek, so piercing it made his skin crawl. She walked slowly, deliberately, as though each step was calculated to intensify the pressure. She stopped when she was just inches away from him. They stood there, locked in a silent battle of wills. Derek could feel the pulse in his ears, his heart pounding so hard it threatened to burst out of his chest. He tried to maintain a neutral expression, to summon the confidence he had once worn like impenetrable armor. But it was slipping away, piece by piece, like sand through his fingers. Margaret finally broke the silence. Her voice was soft but razor-sharp, each word slicing into Derek's pride. "You look terrible," she said, her tone calm yet dripping with contempt. Derek blinked, taken aback by her words. It wasn't the tone he had expected. No rage, no shouting. Just cold, calculated control, the same way she had manipulated him from the very beginning. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he croaked, his voice rough and uneven. He cleared his throat before continuing. "I didn't mean—" Margaret tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering and unyielding. "Didn't mean?" she repeated, her voice quiet yet laced with quiet skepticism. "You didn't mean to hit me? You didn't mean to assault a federal agent? Or you didn't mean to let your power turn you into the man you see in the mirror?" Derek lowered his head, unable to respond. His silence only added weight to Margaret's words. She stepped back, her eyes still locked on him, as if to imprint the inevitability of his downfall into his mind. "Remember this, Derek," she said before turning to leave, her voice resolute. "Every bit of this, everything, is of your own making." The cell door slammed shut, the sound reverberating through the hallway like a final verdict. Derek sank to the floor, guilt and regret crashing over him, trapping him in a reality he could no longer escape. Derek opened his mouth, but the words died on his lips before they could form. There was no reasonable excuse, no explanation strong enough. He couldn't lie. Not to her. Margaret had seen everything. Yes, she had provoked him, but no, she hadn't made him throw that punch. That had been all him. "I didn't know who you were," he muttered, his voice so low it was barely more than a whisper. "I didn't know you were FBI. I thought you were just—" Margaret cut him off, her voice sharp as a blade. "Just some old woman?" The question spilled from her lips, filling the small room with an icy contempt. "Someone you thought didn't matter? Someone you thought you could shove aside without a second thought about the consequences?" Derek clenched his jaw, his gaze darting away. He couldn't meet her scornful eyes. She was right. He had seen her as just another nobody in the wrong place at the wrong time. Someone with no influence, no power to challenge him, to challenge the authority he had grown used to believing was untouchable. "Do you have any idea how many complaints have been filed against you?" Margaret asked, her tone suddenly razor-sharp and brimming with anger. Derek stayed silent, but he didn't need to answer. He knew. He had seen every one of those complaints, read them, and watched them disappear into the void of the police department's internal review system. None of them had mattered. He always knew that as long as the higher-ups had his back, he would be safe. But now, here was Margaret, standing before him, a living testament to a reckoning he couldn't escape. Margaret stepped closer, leaving just a few inches between them. Her gaze bored into him, as if peeling away every layer of defense he had built over the years. "You think you're special, don't you?" she asked, her voice cold and unyielding. "You think you're different from all the other corrupt cops who've been caught? That somehow you're above the law?" Derek felt the heat rising in his chest. The familiar anger was bubbling up, but this time it wasn't his strength, it was helplessness. The raw exposure of himself to a truth he could no longer deny. For years, he'd been told he was special, that he was the kind of cop this city needed. Tough, uncompromising, willing to do what others wouldn't. But now, standing before Margaret Hill, all of that felt hollow, meaningless. "I was doing my job," he snapped, his voice harsher than he intended. "I kept the streets safe." Margaret smirked, the expression devoid of any warmth. "Safe for who?" she asked, her voice laced with sarcasm. "For the people who wouldn't hold you accountable? For those who wouldn't push back when you decided to play God with their lives?" Derek's fists clenched, his muscles taut. He had never felt so exposed, so stripped bare. Each word Margaret spoke sliced deeper into the crumbling pride he had clung to for so long. "You think this is just about you?" Margaret pressed, her voice rising, sharp and unforgiving. "You think you're the only one we're after? You're just a piece of a system that's been rotting from the inside out for years. And now you're watching that system collapse, starting with you." Derek's mind spun in chaos, fragments of the puzzle snapping together, but forming no picture he had hoped for. He had long known this investigation was bigger than just him. But the way Margaret spoke, the sharp glint in her eyes, hinted at a grander conspiracy unfolding, something beyond his control. Margaret wasn't just looking to charge him for assaulting an FBI agent. She wanted to make him a pawn in a plan to dismantle the entire system he had once considered untouchable. "What do you want from me?" Derek asked, his voice trembling slightly. The anger was still there, simmering like embers beneath the ashes, but now it was mingled with something else, fear. The fear of a man realizing the world he had once known was crumbling piece by piece. Margaret stared at him, her gaze cold and unwavering. She stood silent for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before stepping back and folding her arms across her chest. "I want you to talk," she said, her voice calm but heavy with an authority that made the air in the holding cell feel thick and suffocating. "I want you to tell me everything you know about Hanan, about the other officers involved. I want names, dates, details." Derek's stomach churned. Hanan. His mentor. The man who had shielded him from complaints, who had taught him how to navigate the murky waters of law enforcement. Turning on Hanan wasn't just betrayal. For Derek, it felt like severing a part of himself. "I can't," Derek whispered, shaking his head. His voice was barely audible. "I can't do that." Margaret's eyes were icy, unyielding. "You don't have a choice, Derek," she said, each word delivered with the finality of a verdict. "You're facing federal charges. You assaulted an FBI agent. That doesn't get brushed off with a slap on the wrist. You're looking at serious federal prison time. You're finished." Derek's heart pounded against his ribcage, each beat hammering away at the fragile remnants of his resolve. His career, everything he had built, was over. There was no way out. But the thought of betraying Hanan, a man who had been like a father to him, made his chest tighten with dread. Margaret continued, her tone softening slightly, as if offering one final lifeline. "If you cooperate, we can work something out, but if you stay silent, you'll face this alone. And when you're sitting in federal prison, you'll realize that the loyalty you're clinging to means nothing." Derek's mind was a storm of conflicting emotions. He had spent years building his career, protecting his reputation. Yet here he was, with everything crumbling in a matter of hours. Margaret had thrown him a lifeline, but the cost of grabbing it was unbearable. "I need time," he muttered, yet his voice barely more than a whisper. Margaret stared at him, her expression still cold and uncompromising. You don't have much time, Derek. The walls are closing in. You can help us take down the rest of the corruption in your department, or you can go down with it. The choice is yours." With that, she turned and walked toward the cell door, leaving Derek alone with his chaotic thoughts. The door slammed shut behind Margaret, the sound echoing in Derek's ears long after she had gone. In the narrow confines of the cell, he was left with nothing but the hollow emptiness of his own mind and the crushing realization that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of the collapse of everything he had ever known. The arrest of Derek spread like wildfire, appearing across all forms of media, from local television stations to national newspapers. The headlines were sensational. "Rogue cop assaults undercover FBI agent." But the story didn't stop there. As journalists began digging into Derek's past, a slew of misconduct allegations and his connections to a sprawling corruption network within the police department came to light. Public outrage was immediate. A community already fatigued from years of tension with law enforcement erupted into a wave of protests. Outside the police station, crowds gathered, holding banners that read "Justice for All" and "End Police Brutality." The atmosphere was filled with anger and frustration, but above all, there was a sense that this moment was about more than just Derek. It was about an entire system that had allowed individuals like him to thrive for far too long. Margaret Hill stood before a row of screens in a temporary FBI office, monitoring the unfolding news. Her bruised face, a stark reminder of her confrontation with Derek, served as a painful testament to that night. She had taken personal risks working undercover in such a tense and dangerous environment, but now it was paying off. The evidence they had gathered, audio recordings, video footage, and testimonies from victims, had exposed the truth. Derek was merely the tip of the iceberg. Now that they had him, the other corrupt officers wouldn't be far behind. Harris, Margaret's supervisor, stepped beside her, arms crossed as he stared at the screens. "It's bigger than we thought," he said quietly, his tone reflective. "These protests aren't just about Derek. They're about the entire police department." Margaret nodded, her eyes still fixed on the screens. "They've been waiting for this. This community has lived under the control of officers like Derek for years. He's not the only one. This is their chance to finally be heard." Harris glanced at Margaret, his brows knitting slightly. "Do you think things will get worse?" Margaret didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said with certainty. "Once we start pulling this thread, it'll unravel the entire department, and people will push back, both inside and outside the station." Harris sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly under the weight of what was to come. "We're ready for that," he said, though his voice betrayed his weariness. "But this will be a fight. We need Derek to turn the tide. He's our best chance to take down the higher-ups." Margaret's gaze didn't waver from the screen. "He'll turn," she said, her voice steady and confident. "He knows what's coming, and he knows he can't face it alone. He'll talk." Yet even as she said the words, Margaret knew it wouldn't be easy. Derek had been loyal to the system that had protected him for years. He was loyal to Hanan, and that loyalty could be the final obstacle between them and the truth. This wouldn't just be a legal battle. It would be a struggle to expose an entire network of corruption, and it was a fight Margaret was ready to see through to the end. Here's the English translation. Harris stepped into the small meeting room, his voice tense as he looked at Margaret. "We're transferring him to a secure federal facility tomorrow morning," he said. Then he added a line that made Margaret's heart sink. "Tonight, he's still in the city jail." Margaret felt her breathing grow heavier. The city jail, still under Hanan's control. Throughout her career, she had seen the terrible things that powerful figures in law enforcement could do. They didn't need weapons, just a few phone calls, a few veiled threats, and anything. Even a man inside the walls of a police station could disappear. "I'm going to the jail," Margaret declared, grabbing her coat. Her voice was as sharp as a blade. "I'll make sure he's safe until the transfer. If Hanan tries anything, I'll be there." Harris looked at her for a long moment, his eyes full of concern. Finally, he sighed. "Be careful, Hill. Hanan is a dangerous man when he's cornered." Margaret nodded, her voice tense but unwavering. "I know. That's exactly why I have to do this." That night, Margaret walked into the city jail. The air carried a suffocating tension, as if everyone there could sense something looming. The police station was quieter than usual. The protests outside the building had dispersed, but the silence wasn't peaceful. It was the eerie stillness before a storm. Officers moved through the hallways with their heads down, fully aware that the entire department was under scrutiny. Any misstep could draw unwanted attention from the public and the press. Margaret walked past them, her gaze sharp and focused, her stride firm and unyielding. When she reached the holding area, Derek was sitting in his cramped cell. His back was against the wall, his eyes fixed on the floor. His face was pale, and his bloodshot eyes hinted that he hadn't slept in days. As Margaret approached, he looked up. His expression, a mixture of exhaustion, anger, and anxiety, was difficult to read. "You're still here," Margaret said, standing in front of the bars. She looked at him with a stern but compassionate gaze. "Are you afraid you won't make it through the night?" Derek's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Margaret sighed, leaning lightly against the bars, her eyes never leaving his. "I know you're scared," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "Hanin put you in a tough spot, but this is your chance to do the right thing. You can still get out of this with some shred of dignity. If nothing else, you can hold on to that." Derek's eyes lifted, and for the first time they revealed something beyond anger, deep, raw fear. Margaret saw it gnawing at him, like a wild animal clawing incessantly at his mind. He knew what was coming. "I can't," Derek muttered, his voice weak and strained. "You don't understand. Hanan, he won't let me go. He'll kill me before I can say anything." Margaret leaned in closer, her voice calm but filled with unyielding determination. "You're already in danger, Derek. Hanan won't stop at threats, but if you help us, we can protect you. We can take Hanan down, and you won't have to look over your shoulder for the rest of your life." Derek hesitated, his hands trembling as he ran them through his hair. Margaret could see the battle raging within him, the fear of Hanin clashing with the faint glimmer of hope that he might escape this living nightmare. She stood there, waiting, knowing that any more words could shatter the fragile balance inside him. Derek sat silently, his hands clenched tightly on his knees as if trying to grasp at the last threads of control. The dim light of the cell cast shadows on his face, revealing the exhaustion and despair etched deeply into his features. His words came out like a quiet confession, barely escaping his dry lips. "You don't know what it's like," Derek whispered, his voice just loud enough for Margaret to hear. "The things we've done, the things I've done. Not just Hanan, all of us, we're all filthy." Margaret's heart pounded in her chest. This was it, the moment Derek's hardened shell began to crack, exposing the man beneath. She could feel the torment in every word he spoke, and she knew that if she handled this carefully, she might coax out the admission she needed. "Help me clean it up," Margaret said, her voice soft but resolute. "You don't have to go down with them, Derek. You can get out of this, but you have to help me." Derek's eyes locked onto hers. For a fleeting moment, Margaret thought she saw a spark of determination flicker to life, but it vanished just as quickly, replaced by the familiar look of fear. Derek shook his head, his voice trembling. "I can't," he said, his words barely audible. I can't." Margaret's stomach sank. Fear had burrowed too deeply into Derek, paralyzing him. Hanin's grip on him wasn't just physical, it was a web of terror and control that imprisoned his mind. Derek was too scared to break free. "I'll be back tomorrow morning to transfer you," Margaret said, stepping away from the bars. She kept her tone steady, though a sense of helplessness lingered in her words. "You'll be safe." As she turned to leave, Derek's faint voice stopped her. "Agent Hill?" Margaret paused, glancing back over her shoulder. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "for giving me a chance." Margaret nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and walked away. But her mind was already racing, planning her next move. She knew tonight wouldn't be peaceful, and Hanan wouldn't sit idly by while Derek was alive to tell the truth. The early hours of the morning loomed heavy, like a nightmare with no end. The sky remained cloaked in darkness as Margaret drove through the empty streets toward the city jail. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her thoughts replaying Derek's words from the night before. "We're all filthy." Those words echoed in her mind, a haunting reminder that the corruption within the police department wasn't just surface-level grime. It was a disease that had festered and spread through layers of complicity. The car's headlights pierced the darkness, illuminating the towering structure ahead, the city jail. It loomed like a fortress of concrete, cold and unyielding. A guard stood at the entrance, his face obscured by shadows. Margaret felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Everything was too quiet, too easy. Margaret had checked in with Harris before leaving. She knew this system could betray even those within it at any moment. Hanan was a dangerous man, and she knew he wouldn't sit idly by, waiting for defeat. He would do whatever it took to ensure Derek's silence, at any cost. Margaret took a deep breath, trying to steady herself as she stepped out of the car. Tonight, she wasn't just fighting Hanan. She was up against an entire system that had rotted from the inside out for years. Margaret stepped out of the car, her shoes hitting the dew-soaked ground of the early morning. The icy air wrapped around her, seeping through every layer of clothing. But the chill she felt wasn't just from the weather. It came from the unease filling her mind. She glanced at the police station building, her eyes narrowing as she noticed something unusual. The lights, typically bright and ever-present, seemed sparser now, leaving sections cloaked in an ominous shadow. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Nothing could have gone wrong, she reassured herself, but even as the thought crossed her mind, a shiver ran down her spine. The sound of the wind whipping through the air made everything feel even more foreboding, like a whispered warning. The guard at the entrance nodded as she flashed her FBI badge. He stepped aside, allowing her in. The air inside felt just as off. Instead of the usual hum of officers bustling about, there was only a heavy, oppressive silence. Margaret walked down the hallway, the sense of unease growing with every step. The sound of her heels echoed in the quiet, amplifying the eerie emptiness. As she neared the holding area, dim, flickering lights cast long, sinister shadows on the walls. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. She passed by the cells, her eyes scanning each door. Empty. They were all empty, except for the last one, where Derek was supposed to be. The door to Derek's cell was wide open. A cold draft from the hallway blew in, making Margaret instinctively place a hand on the gun at her side. She drew it, moving forward quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what awaited her, but she knew this wasn't normal. When she reached the cell, the sight before her froze her in place. Derek lay motionless on the floor, his body cold and still as stone. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The air grew heavy, suffocating, as if all the oxygen in the room had been sucked out. "No," Margaret whispered, her voice trembling. She dropped to her knees beside him, two shaky fingers pressing against his neck, searching for a pulse. Nothing. His skin was ice cold, no pulse, no breath. Derek was dead. A wave of nausea rose in Margaret's stomach. She struggled to maintain her composure, but her mind swirled with questions. How could this have happened? Who let this happen? And most importantly, was this an accident, or had someone made sure Derek would never get the chance to talk? Her eyes darted around the cell, searching for any clues that might explain what had happened. But there was only an eerie, deafening silence. She knew she couldn't afford to stand still. Derek might be gone, but this case was far from over. And if this was part of a larger scheme, she needed to uncover who was behind it before the truth was buried forever. Before leaving, everything seemed normal on paper. Derek was still in custody, and the transfer was scheduled for the morning. Yet, the palpable sense of fear hanging in the air told Margaret otherwise. Margaret parked her car in the lot, taking a deep breath before stepping out. The biting cold of the morning wind cut through her skin like sharp blades, seeping through every layer of clothing. She looked up at the building ahead, her eyes narrowing as she noticed something unusual. There were fewer lights than usual. A police station was always buzzing with activity, especially near the holding area. But tonight, the atmosphere was disturbingly different. Too quiet, too still. The guard at the door gave her a nod as Margaret flashed her FBI badge. He stepped aside, allowing her entry. She walked down the hallway, the sense of unease in her gut growing stronger. The holding area, usually bustling with officers coming and going, was eerily deserted. There were no conversations, no rustling of papers, no clinking of keys, just an oppressive, unsettling silence. Margaret's footsteps echoed in the space, each one sounding like a warning. She headed towards cell block C, where Derek was being held. As the door to the cell block creaked open, Margaret felt her heart skip a beat. A deep sense of foreboding surged through her, enveloping her completely. Her hand instinctively moved toward the gun on her hip, though she kept it holstered. The block was dimly lit, with a few flickering lights casting long, ominous shadows across the floor. Margaret's eyes scanned each cell as she walked past. All of them were empty, except for the very last one, the one where Derek was supposed to be. Her pulse quickened as she approached. The door to Derek's cell was wide open. Margaret's hand shot to her gun, drawing it as she surged forward. Her heart pounded violently in her chest. She reached the cell and froze. Derek was lying motionless on the floor. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The air in the room was thick, suffocating. She stood there, staring at their limp body, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. But reality hit her like a sledgehammer. Derek wasn't Moore. Derek wasn't moving. His chest wasn't rising. There was no sound, no sign of life. "No," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. She dropped to her knees beside him, weapon still drawn, and pressed 2 fingers against his neck, searching for a pulse. Her fingers trembled as they touched his cold skin. Nothing. She checked again, desperately hoping she was wrong. But the reality didn't change. Derek was dead. A wave of nausea churned in Margaret's stomach. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but her mind was racing with questions. Who let this happen? Was this an accident or something deliberate? And most importantly, who's next? Margaret stood in the cell, the cold light from the flickering neon casting sharp lines across her face, accentuating the tension she could no longer hide. Before her, Derek lay motionless on the floor, his half-open eyes staring into nothingness. There was no blood, no signs of a struggle, only an oppressive, deafening silence that filled the room. She swallowed hard, a chill running down her spine as she gazed at Derek's lifeless body. Just hours ago, she had been here, trying to convince him to cooperate and bring Hanan down. He had been terrified, not just for himself, but for the consequences he knew would follow if he spoke up. But at least, he had been alive. Now Derek was nothing more than a clear, unambiguous message, a brutal and calculated warning. Margaret's mind reeled, frantically trying to piece together the events that had led to this tragedy. She knew, without a doubt, that Hanan was behind this. Derek had been a threat to the corrupt empire Hanan had built. He couldn't let Derek talk, and so he had ensured Derek never would. With trembling hands, Margaret pulled her phone from her pocket and dialed Harris. After 2 rings, his familiar voice came through, tinged with both concern and apprehension. "Margaret, what's going on?" She took a deep breath, trying to steady her voice. "Derek is dead," she said, her tone calm and measured, though a storm raged within her. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Harris responded, his voice tight. "Dead? How? Why am I only hearing about this now?" Margaret shook her head as if he could see the gesture. "I don't know the details. There's no sign of a struggle, no visible wounds, but this isn't natural. Derek was scared. He was ready to turn against Hanan, to spill everything. Now he's dead. I'm certain Hanan got to him first." Another silence, longer this time, stretched across the line. When Harris finally spoke, his voice was heavier. "Do we have anything on Hanan? Any leads that can pin this on him?" "Not yet," Margaret admitted, her voice low. "But we need to move quickly. Hanan is cleaning up his mess, and Derek isn't the only one involved. There are other officers, other vulnerabilities. If we don't act now, we'll lose everything." Harris exhaled audibly, but when he spoke again, his voice was calm and resolute. "All right, I'll call the team. We're not letting this slide." Margaret hung up, her hands still shaking as she slid the phone back into her pocket. She glanced down at Derek's body one last time, a bitter mix of anger and frustration bubbling in her chest. Derek had been part of the corruption, yes, but he had chosen her side, and he had been the key to taking Hanan down, to exposing the rot within the police department. Now, with him gone, the path ahead seemed more uncertain than ever. Turning away from the lifeless body, Margaret stepped out of the cell. Her mind had been racing through the steps she needed to take, but everything had shifted. When Margaret walked into the FBI office, the atmosphere was charged with urgency. Her colleagues were operating at full capacity, driven and determined, but the tension was etched on every face. Margaret headed straight for Harris, who was staring intently at the investigative board. "I can feel things unraveling," Harris said, his tone heavy with worry. "Margaret, did you find anything in the cell?" Margaret shook her head. "Nothing but the body. Every trace was wiped clean. This had to be an inside job. Hanan won't stop, and we need to stay one step ahead." Harris nodded. "We have a list of officers who might be involved. I'll hand it over to the tech team, but we need a lead. Fast." Margaret stepped out of the holding area, her gaze heavy as she caught the worried glances of the first shift officers. The tension in the air was palpable, like a thick fog hanging over the station. Rumors about Derek's death were already starting to spread, and Margaret knew the silence wouldn't last long. She had to act quickly before everything spiraled out of control. Derek's death was more than just a tragedy. It was a wake-up call, not just for her, but for the entire system. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced down to see a message from a team member. Hanan made several calls last night. Her pulse quickened. This could be a lead, something she could use to tie Hanan to Derek's death. But she knew it wouldn't be enough on its own. Hanan was smart, meticulous, and wouldn't leave a trail without taking every precaution to cover it up. Still, it was a thread she could pull, and once she did, his entire web of lies might begin to unravel. When Margaret returned to the FBI office, the urgency in the air was unmistakable. Everyone was working at full tilt. Harris stood at the center, orchestrating efforts to gather evidence before it could be destroyed. Teams were combing through phone records, surveillance footage, and anything that could link Hanan to Derek's murder. "Margaret," Harris called out as she walked in. "We've got something." His voice was sharp with urgency. "Hanan made several calls last night. One of them went to a burner phone, and we traced it to someone in law enforcement." A jolt of adrenaline surged through Margaret. "Law enforcement?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. Harris nodded, his expression grim. "It looks that way. We're tracking him now. If we can tie this guy to Derek's death, we can get to Hanan." Margaret's mind raced. Hanan was cunning, always with contingencies in place. He wouldn't go down easily, but this time he had slipped, underestimating her and her team. He thought silencing Derek would stop the investigation in its tracks, but Margaret wasn't about to let that happen. "We need to move now," she said, her voice steely with determination, "before he gets a chance to disappear." As the team sprang into action, Margaret felt the weight of Derek's death pressing heavily on her shoulders. But instead of weakening her resolve, it strengthened it. This wasn't just about justice for Derek. It was about dismantling the corrupt system Hanan had built over the years. As the sun began to rise, its pale light filtered into the bustling office. The wheels were already in motion. Margaret's team had identified the law enforcement officer connected to Hanan's burner phone, and an arrest warrant was in progress. They were monitoring Hanan's every move, ready to strike when the moment came. Margaret knew this was their one shot to end the game, and she couldn't afford to let it slip away. Here's the English translation of the text, capturing the tone and nuances. However, instead of discouraging her, it only strengthened her resolve. She reminded herself that the corruption in this police department ran deep, but she wouldn't stop until she rooted out every last piece of it. That early morning, Margaret stood in front of the police station. Her breath was visible in the cold morning air. The sun had just risen, casting a faint golden glow over the city. She could feel the anticipation and tension within herself as she braced for the mission ahead, the day they would bring down Lieutenant Greg Hannon. Derek's death had triggered a chain of events that escalated everything to emergency mode. Hannon had made a critical mistake, and now the FBI had enough evidence to bring it all to an end. The investigation had led them to a vital clue. Calls Hannon had made to a disposable phone. That phone had linked him to an enforcer who handled delicate matters for clients willing to pay. The enforcer was apprehended overnight and quickly flipped, revealing everything. He confirmed that it was Hannon who ordered Derek's murder to ensure his silence. Margaret felt a surge of grim satisfaction as she finally held the evidence she'd been chasing for so long. Hannon had made a fatal error, and now it was time for him to pay the price. Margaret stood outside the station, her eyes sharp as blades, as she waited for the rest of the team to arrive. The FBI agents she'd been working with for months were gathering and preparing for the raid. Inside the building, the day shift officers were beginning to clock in. completely unaware of what was about to unfold. This was the culmination of months of hard work, and Margaret knew everything depended on today going according to plan. Harris appeared beside her, his expression somber yet resolute. "Are you ready for this?" He asked, his eyes searching hers. Margaret nodded, her voice firm. "I've been waiting for this day for a long time." The team had spent hours meticulously planning every detail of the operation. They had the warrant to arrest Hanan and were ready to search his office, seize personal records, and expose every secret he'd kept hidden. This wasn't just about Derek's death. It was about dismantling the entire web of corruption Hanan had built within the department. As the final FBI agents arrived, Harris signaled the team to move in. Margaret and Harris led the way, stepping through the doors of the police station with their badges prominently displayed. Tension rose as they crossed the lobby, with officers turning to watch them, many of their expressions a mix of confusion and unease. Margaret knew this confrontation would not only define her career, but also the future of law enforcement in this city. Inside Hanan's office, he sat quietly, his cold eyes fixed on the FBI team storming in. He didn't react, didn't show surprise, only the unnerving calm of someone who knew his time had run out. Margaret stepped forward, her gaze locked onto his. "Lieutenant Hannan," she said, her voice steady and commanding, breaking the tense silence. "You're under arrest for corruption, obstruction of justice, and ordering murder. This is the end for you." Hannan looked at her, a faint, contemptuous smile curling at the corner of his mouth. "You think arresting me will change anything, Hill?" he said, his voice low and dripping with sarcasm. "This system has been rotten for a long time. Taking me down is nothing more than a scratch on the surface." Margaret didn't flinch. "Maybe so," she replied, her eyes burning with determination. "But we'll start with you, and I promise you, everything you've built will come crashing down, piece by piece." The room remained silent as they cuffed Hanan and led him away, the air thick with unspoken tension. Margaret took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. This wasn't the end, but it was an important beginning, and she wouldn't stop until every shadowy corner of this system was brought into the light. "Hash!" The officers at the reception desk barely had time to process what was happening before scattering to secure the area and advancing toward Hanan's office. The atmosphere inside the police station shifted instantly. Whispers spread like wildfire, and the expressions of the officers turned from shock to confusion, and finally to fear. Everyone knew something monumental was unfolding, and there was nothing they could do but wait. Hanan's office was at the end of a long hallway, the door shut tightly, with the blinds drawn. Margaret's heart pounded as they approached. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. This was it. This was what they had worked tirelessly for months to achieve. Harris stepped up to the door, rapping sharply 3 times, his voice authoritative and commanding. "Lieutenant Hanan, FBI, open the door now." A tense pause followed, stretching into what felt like an eternity, as though the entire world held its breath. Margaret rested her hand on the pistol holstered at her side, ready for anything. She glanced at Harris, her mind racing through a dozen possibilities. What if Hanan fled? What if he was armed? What if he resisted? The door creaked open slowly, and Hanan appeared in the doorway. His expression was calm, but his eyes betrayed him. There was a shadow in his gaze, defiance, or perhaps resignation. He glanced from Margaret to Harris, then to the agents behind them. "What is this about?" Hanan asked, his tone calm but dripping with sarcasm. "You know exactly what this is about," Margaret replied, stepping forward, her voice sharp as a blade. "You're under arrest for the murder of Derek Kane, obstruction of justice, and orchestrating corruption within this police department." For a moment, Hanan didn't move. He stood there, his eyes flicking between Margaret and Harris as if calculating his options. Then, slowly, he stepped aside, allowing the agents into his office. Margaret noted the tension in Hanan's posture. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, but he didn't resist. Harris stepped forward, pulling out a pair of handcuffs, and gestured for Hanan to turn around. Hanan's jaw tightened, but he complied, turning and placing his hands behind his back. With practiced precision, Harris secured the cuffs, the metallic click echoing in the small office. Margaret watched intently, waiting for a word, a reaction, anything from Hanan, but he remained silent. No denial, No protest, no fear, just a heavy silence as Harris led him out of the room. Hanan's now vacant office became the epicenter of the investigation. Margaret stood in the center of the room, her eyes scanning every detail. This was where it had all happened, where Hanan had orchestrated his schemes, silenced complaints, manipulated reports, and protected officers like Derek. She could feel the weight of years of deceit, lies, and abuse of power lingering in the air. Margaret began methodically searching Hanan's desk, opening each drawer, sifting through files, and scrutinizing everything that might strengthen their case. Meanwhile, Harris had confiscated Hanan's personal computer, while the team carefully collected other electronic devices. They knew that every byte of data, every fragment of evidence from these materials could be the key to unraveling the web of corruption Hanan had built. Outside, an eerie silence enveloped the station, as though everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the fallout. But Margaret knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Arresting Hanan was a victory, but the real battle lay in dismantling the entire system he had cultivated over the years, and she was determined, more than ever, to see it through until every truth was brought to light. Margaret stood in the office, her gaze sweeping over the scattered files and papers on Hanan's desk. Her mind kept replaying the moment they cuffed him. It was the moment she had waited for, yet the feeling of victory was overshadowed by a bitter truth. The battle was far from over. As she flipped through the files, her hand brushed against a small leather-bound notebook hidden at the back of a drawer. Margaret carefully pulled it out, her eyes widening as she turned its pages. Her heart seemed to stop for a moment. Inside the notebook were names, dozens of them, including officers, informants, and civilians. Some were accompanied by numbers, likely representing bribes, transactions, and favors. This notebook was irrefutable evidence, a written record of years of corruption. Margaret felt a surge of anger and determination swell in her chest. This wasn't just evidence to convict Hanan, it was a roadmap of the entire corrupt network he had built. Every illicit deal, every cover-up, every connection was documented. She closed the notebook, tucking it into her coat as if she were holding a piece of history, the final puzzle piece. Outside, the police station buzzed with activity as news of Hanan's arrest spread. A crowd had gathered, including reporters and protesters. News cameras flashed incessantly as journalists jostled to capture the moment. Hanan, once a respected figure in the police department, now appeared in handcuffs. The sight was a catalyst for the pent-up anger and frustration in the community. Some in the crowd shouted in rage, while others cheered, a mix of relief and skepticism. For them, this wasn't just the downfall of one man. It was the first step toward dismantling a system that had betrayed the very people it was meant to serve. Margaret stood on the steps of the station observing the scene, her eyes fixed on Hanan as agents escorted him away. Hanan maintained a stoic expression, refusing to meet the crowd's gaze, refusing to acknowledge the reality. Yet Margaret saw the fear in his eyes, the tension in his shoulders as he was pushed into the waiting car. The car door slammed shut with a resounding thud. Margaret took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. Harris stepped up beside her, his expression a blend of exhaustion and satisfaction. "We did it," he said softly, his voice carrying a mix of relief and weariness. Margaret nodded, but her emotions were more complex. "Yes, we brought Hanan down, but there are others, officers who turned a blind eye, those who colluded with him. This fight isn't over." Harris didn't respond immediately. He simply stood there with Margaret, looking out at the crowd below, faces filled with hope, anger, and relief. The chants echoed in the air, a mix of celebration and a reminder that justice must continue. Margaret turned away, her hand still gripping the notebook inside her coat. A powerful sense of determination surged within her. The road ahead was long, but today they had proven that change was possible, and she wouldn't stop until every truth was brought to light. As the chants of the crowd outside continued to echo, Margaret stood on the steps of the police station, her gaze fixed on the sea of faces before her. Cries of "justice," "accountability," "no more corruption" rang out, a powerful declaration of change. The atmosphere was electrified, and Margaret could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on her. This wasn't just about dealing with Derek or Hanan. It was the beginning of exposing a system that had been twisted in the shadows for years. She leaned back against the wall behind her, taking a deep breath. Memories flooded her mind from the day she first decided to take the risk and uncover the truth. She remembered the confrontations with Derek and Hanan, men who once believed they were untouchable. But now, everything had changed. Derek's death, despite his guilt, remained a bitter reminder of the cost of silence. Harris approached, standing beside her, his voice warm yet heavy with contemplation. "Do you think we'll ever clean out all the corruption?" Margaret replied softly, but with unwavering resolve. "Maybe not completely, but we have to start somewhere." Harris nodded. "Corruption is like weeds. You pull one out and two more grow in its place. But today we did something different." Margaret felt the weight of his words. The system had been laid bare, and now they had a chance to rebuild from the ground up. It would take time, but change was possible. That night, in her small apartment, Margaret sat quietly by the window, looking out over the city. The weight of the day's events pressed heavily on her shoulders, yet for the first time in a long while she felt a sense of peace. The phone on the table buzzed, and a message from Harris lit up the screen. "We made a difference today. Get some rest." She smiled, setting the phone down and leaning back in her chair. It had been a long, grueling fight, but they had made a difference. They had brought down someone who once seemed untouchable, and this was just the beginning.